Good afternoon, everyone. Last week, we talked about judgment before automation. The question we asked was, what are you teaching the system to repeat for you? We talked about automation as a decision that keeps on acting after the decision is made. Once you encode the decision into a system, that decision can continue tomorrow, next week, with the next customer across different channels, and often without you having to think about it ever again. But most importantly, we said that judgment does not disappear when the execution becomes automated. Judgment simply moves upstream before the boom in the in the execution process. And today, I want to move the discussion one step further outward. Because once the system begins repeating a behavior on behalf of the business, other people can begin experiencing that behavior and they will learn from it. So today's question is, what are you teaching people to expect from your business? Let's start with something very ordinary. Imagine a customer interacts with the same business 3 different times. The first time, they scheduled a service. The information they receive is accurate. The appointment means what they were told it means. The person performing the service knows what was promised. The customer does not have to explain everything again. Boring. Nothing exciting happened. Then the customer contacts the business again. This time they have a question. The person responding can see the previous interaction, and the answer they give makes sense in light of what the customer has already experienced. Again, nothing spectacular. Then something goes wrong in the process. Maybe the schedule changes. Maybe something happens internally to the business, and the original commitment cannot be met exactly as planned. But somebody notices. Somebody takes responsibility for the change. The customer is told what is actually happening. The next step is made clear, and the revised commitment is kept. At no point did the business stop and say, okay, after 3 interactions, you should be able to trust us now, right? That would be a rather odd conversation. But what happened instead? The customer accumulated evidence. The business behaved predictably. The customer observed that behavior, and from that behavior, the customer began forming an expectation about what would probably happen next. And this is the movement that I want you to see. A decision leads to repeated behavior. The behavior is evidence to outside audiences. That evidence develops expectations, and as long as those expectations are met, it creates reliance or reliability or predictability. And that gives us the central proposition for today's conversation. Operations produce evidence of trustworthiness. People decide whether that evidence is sufficient to be trustworthy. A business can influence trustworthiness. It can produce evidence. It can make commitments and keep them. It can create dependable systems. It can communicate accurately. It can behave responsibly when circumstances change. But the business does not get to reach inside another person's head and install trust. That other person retains agency. They decide whether the evidence is sufficient upon which for them to rely. So this is not going to be a lesson about building trust as though trust were another widget that we can install in a funnel. And it also isn't a lesson about being more likable. The question is more foundational, more operational, more practical. What does the way this business repeatedly behave give other people reasons to expect? What does the way this business repeatedly behaves give other people reason to expect? Because operations teach people what to expect long before the business ever asks whether it is a trusted entity. Businesses say many good things about themselves. We care, we're dependable, quality matters, customers come first, you can trust us. Usually those statements are very sincere. I do not assume somebody is lying because their website says they care about customers. I believe that the business intends their published values to reflect their actual values. But sincerity is not the same thing as evidence. The person interacting with the business sees something else. They see whether the promises mean anything. They see whether the information remains accurate. They see whether handoffs work. They see whether communications make sense from one person to the next. They see whether boundaries are respected and whether someone actually follows through. And eventually they see what happens when something goes wrong. Trust is not the claim. Trustworthiness is the evidence behind the claim. And I want to distinguish a few key words because we use them casually as though they all mean approximately the same thing. They do not. Consistency. Consistency means behavior repeats in a recognizable pattern. That is useful, but consistency by itself tells us nothing about whether the behavior is good. A business can consistently fail to respond. A system can consistently bypass the process because they learned the process does not work. Oh, I've got that. A system can, can consistently send the wrong information. An employee can consistently bypass the process because they have learned that the process does not work. And all three of those are still consistency. Predictability. Predictability means somebody can reasonably anticipate what is likely to happen. Again, predictability can be good or it can be bad. A customer may know with great confidence, if I call them, I'm going to have to explain the entire situation from the beginning. That business has become predictable, but we probably should not put that predictability on the brochure. Reliability goes even further. A person or system can reasonably be depended upon to perform appropriately under the conditions for which it has accepted responsibility. And that last phrase of the sentence matters. Under the conditions for which it has accepted responsibility. We do not expect any system to do everything. We do expect it to appropriately do what it has claimed responsibility for doing. Trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is the accumulated evidence that gives another person legitimate reason to consider the business, person, or system worthy of reliance. And then there is trust. All of this is about trust. Trust is what the other person actually Trust is what the other person actually decides to do with the evidence. They rely on it or they do not rely on it. That decision belongs with them. Two people can observe the exact same evidence and make different decisions about risk depending upon their own context, which is why I want to be careful about language that sounds like creating trust, building trust. We can produce evidence of trustworthiness. The other person decides what that evidence means in terms of their willingness to rely on that evidence. And then there's one more term that will become especially important today for today's presentation and discussion: recovery. Recovery is what happens after an error, after an exception, after a failed handoff, after a missed expectation, or some other departure from the normal path. Recovery is not merely I'm sorry about that. Yes, an apology may be entirely appropriate, but a governed recovery restores something operational. A governed recovery restores clarity, responsibility, authority, corrective action, and a path forward that the both people can actually understand. So a distinction I want us to carry through the entire lesson is consistency does not equal reliability. Another distinction, reliability does not compel trust. The business produces evidence. The other stakeholder still gets to decide whether that evidence is sufficient. This is not a defect in the system. This is what makes trust meaningful. Let's look at what happens when the behavior repeats. The line under the title says repeated behavior leads to the question, what happens here? That is really what expectations are. People encounter the same operating system over time, and they begin answering for the question for themselves, what happens here? And I deliberately put three different stakeholders on the slide because trust is not merely a customer issue, but we can start with the customer. The customer learns what replies make sense. Do replies make sense? Do appointments mean something? What about those appointments have meaning? Do promises survive a handoff? When a handoff happens, does the next representative have the context? If I tell one person something, will the next person know, or will I have to repeat myself? Do I need to keep my own records because this business is going to lose them? Notice how quickly ordinary operating behavior becomes relational evidence. Or we can look at an employee or team member of the organization. They also are learning from the behavior of the business. Is the SOP actually current? Can I trust the data in the customer record? If I've been delegated authority, is that authority real? Or is it in paper only? If I make a reasonable decision within the bounds that I think I was given, will my leadership support that decision? If I escalate something to that leadership, does the escalation actually produce help? Or does it simply produce another meeting? People are learning. Or then there's the business partner, a partner, a business partner, a referral partner, a collaborator, a vendor, even a professional ally who's only an associate they're also watching. And they're thinking, if I introduce someone to this business, will they be treated responsibly? Will starting that communication create a reputational risk for me? Will my professional boundaries be respected? Can this business be trusted with the relationship that I'm attaching to the introduction? So the operating system may be the same for the business, but different stakeholders are receiving different evidence from it. And those expectations are compounding. And that is why the line matters. Every repeated interaction deposits evidence into someone else's expectation of the business. And I do not mean that there's some sort of trust points system. There's no scoring metric. We're not trying to manipulate people into giving us a higher trust rating. The point is simply accumulation. People observe, people remember, people adapt, and they begin to anticipate. The customer may learn they always follow up, or nobody replies. Nobody reads replies. Nobody follows up. An employee may learn the SOP is usually right, or don't trust the SOP, Ask Sarah. A partner may learn, they handle my introductions carefully. Or, I need to stay involved because I'm not sure what will happen next. Those expectations are probably not written anywhere, but they govern the actual human behavior. And this is one of the ways that judgment becomes visible. The operator's judgment may begin as something abstract, a decision, a policy, a workflow rule, a leadership standard, but eventually that judgment becomes observable through dependable behavior. We said last week, people do not experience the intention, they experience what happens. And I want to spend a few minutes on a case where nothing goes wrong. Because if all we talk about is failures and recovery, we can actually accidentally make reliability sound like emergency management. Most evidence of trustworthiness is much more boring than that. So look at this sequence. Schedule, prepare, handoff, deliver, next. A customer schedules a service, the information is correct, the customer knows what they need to do, the business knows what it needs to do. Before delivery, whatever preparation is required actually happens, and the work hands off from one person or system to another. The context survives the handoff. The person receiving the work understands what has already happened and what is still promised. The work is delivered, and afterward, everyone knows what next means. Maybe next means a follow-up, maybe billing, maybe another appointment, maybe a request for referral or review. Maybe simply the relationship is complete. Nothing particularly impressive has happened. No one saved the day. There was no emergency rescue behavior. Nobody stayed up until midnight heroically fixing something that should have worked at 2 p.m. the afternoon before. All of this is a good thing. Clear information, kept commitments, context preserved, responsibility visible. These are not glamorous, but from the customer's experience, they are evidence. From the customer's perspective, and from the employee's perspective, they are evidence too. Can I rely on the information I received? Can I trust that the person upstream actually did their part? Does the responsibility become visible when the work reaches me? Do I know what done means in my stage of the process? Dependability is often very boring from the inside, but is very valuable from the outside of the system. A mature system should feel unremarkable to the people operating it. Things simply happen when they should. That ordinariness is often the perfect outcome. In real life, we tend to notice the dramatic stage. But a business that constantly needs rescue behavior is giving information about the system too. Ordinary dependability is the quieter evidence. The promise and the behavior correspond. And again, and again, and again. That is how expectations form. But ordinary operation is only part of the test because reality eventually refuses to cooperate with our process map. Last week, we talked about the normal path. The rule fits. The system knows what to do. Execution continues, and then something changes. The normal path no longer describes reality. That is the exception. And last week, the question was, what should the system do when the rule stops fitting? For the system, the question is, how do I govern the rule? How do I know when the rule applies or doesn't apply? Today, we're asking a different question about the same situation. We're asking, what does the affected person experience when the rule stops fitting. This is where reliability becomes much more interesting. The sequence here is the normal path hits an exception, resulting in a governed recovery. And I'm deliberately saying governed recovery, not simply recovery, because recovery is not theater. It is not, we sent a nice apology email. It is not, we gave them a coupon. It is not even necessarily, we made the customer happy. A governed recovery means that the situation remains manageable after reality departs from the normal path. Somebody notices, or somebody has a way to raise an issue. Responsibility becomes clear. The person affected knows what is happening. Authority moves somewhere capable of exercising the judgment that is now needed. The organization stops pretending that the exception is still the normal case. The information is corrected, the action is corrected where possible, and a viable path forward is established. Reliability does not mean nothing ever goes wrong. Reliability means the system remains governable when something goes wrong. And this is a much higher standard than nothing breaks. Everything is going to break eventually. The world has opinions. Customers behave unexpectedly. Employees get sick. Software changes. Vendors miss deadlines. Weather happens. Information turned out to be wrong. Someone misunderstood something. Economic circumstances change. Tariffs and regulations change. A process that requires reality to behave exactly as predicted is not a dependable process yet. Which is why a system that works only when reality behaves exactly as predicted is not yet a dependable system. And I'm not saying that every exception must be predictable. As we said last week, that would be impossible. You do not have to sit down and invent all 847 unique, weird things that could happen on a customer journey. The requirement is not omniscience. The requirement is governability. When something that we did not anticipate happens, do we still know how to recognize that the normal rule no longer applies? Can our responsibility become visible? Can we shift authority leadership? Can the correct person make the next appropriate decision? Because monitoring gives us new evidence. And the new evidence should lead us to a reassessment. Again, this is a direct connection to last week. Last week, we were talking inside the system. This week, we're talking about how that system appears to the outside observer. The exception itself becomes evidence. And the reassessment may determine that nothing needs to change. Perhaps this was a genuinely unusual situation. Or maybe the thing that we thought was an exception is happening every single Thursday. At some point, that then stops being an exception and starts being an evidence that the system itself needs revision. And maybe agency matters here. The customer needs some reasonable way to question, correct, choose, refuse, or escalate. Otherwise, their agency has been removed from them. The employee needs enough authority to exercise responsibility that they actually have been assigned. Otherwise, they're a robot. The system should not become predictable by making everyone except the designer powerless. So, trustworthy systems govern responsibility without making people inside them helpless. So let's talk about a concrete example. We have a customer with a scheduled service. Something changes inside the business, internal, and the promised delivery is clearly going to be late. But the automation does not know, so the automated message still goes out telling the customer that everything is proceeding normally. And that is the starting point on both sides of this slide. It's the same business, it's the same delay, it's the same initial failure. Watch what the customer learns from what happens next. In the case of an ungoverned exception, first, the automated communication is contradicting reality. The customer has now received inaccurate information from the business and no one notices the discrepancy. But the customer calls and the employee who answers cannot fully see the situation, so the customer repeats the story. Who has responsibility is ambiguous. The employee does not know who owns the problem. Meanwhile, the customer receives another automated message, and the normal system keeps operating as though the exception never occurred. Eventually, somebody apologizes. But the apology does not restore clarity. The customer still does not know who owns the situation. Now they don't even know which information is current. They may not know whether the next commitment means anything. Look at that carefully. The system that we designed last week was predictable. It may even have been technically consistent, as we said. The automations fired, the progress followed its program steps, but it was not operationally reliable. Why? Because the business could not be depended upon to behave appropriately once the reality stopped matching the normal path. So compare that to the governed exception. Same initial problem. An internal condition has changed, and the business is no longer going to meet delivery expectations. But this time, the changed condition is noted. The normal automation is either stopped or altered. New responsibilities become explicit. Someone with the appropriate authority evaluates the situation and informs the customer with accurate information. Where appropriate, they're even given options. The revised commitment becomes clear to all involved. The outcome is monitored, and afterward, the business asks, do we need to revise the underlying process because of what we just learned? The exceptional situation was recognized, the business adapted to the new reality, the system remained governable. It demonstrated reliability. The business demonstrated reliability. This last phrase matters. We're not claiming perfection. The business, in fact, still missed the original delivery. That is a truth. That happened. The evidence of reliability appeared in what the business did once the exception existed. That is why the question is not, which company made the customer happier? It is, what did the customer learn about the business from each version of the experience? In the first version, perhaps they learned when something unusual happens, the system will keep talking even though nobody really knows what is happening. Or they might learn, I need to keep checking because the business communications cannot be trusted when circumstances change. Neither one of those is a good thing for the business's reputation. In the second version, they might learn something like, this business can make a mistake and still behave clearly, articulately, trustworthy. That is much closer to the actual meaning of reliability. And there is an agency question buried inside this case too. Who is allowed to do what? Who executes the correction? Who may communicate on behalf of the business? Who has authority to change the commitment? Who has judgment authority over the remedy? Who accepted responsibility for the original promise? Those are all different questions. This is where the layers of agency matter. And the reason I had that lesson earlier this year. Execution, representation, judgment, responsibility, authority. They have to fit together well enough that when the exception occurs, the business does not simply shrug and say, I'm not sure who can do anything about this. And if you work under different business models, the appropriate expectation may differ. A SaaS provider may supply a tool used in the customer's process. The marketing partner or agency may have taken greater responsibility for the communication or the message or the campaign that was transmitted using the tool. Same technical system, different legitimate expectation of responsibility. And that is why reliability is not a generic promise. It is always connected to what responsibility the business actually accepted. So far, we spent a lot of time looking through the customer's eyes. Now let's look internal to the business. Here is the official operating system. It is intended to be authoritative. It is intended to be the source of truth. It is the CRM. It is the workflow. It is the customer records. It's the roles and responsibilities. It's the agendas. It's the places where the work is supposedly represented. But around it, something else starts happening. A spreadsheet, personal notes. DMs in Slack, a duplicate checklist, a ask the owner because I'm not sure technique. Why? The easy explanation is employees resist being tied into systems. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes they do. But that explanation is also too easy. It's too convenient. Sometimes the employee has good reasons not to trust the official system. If the CRM is regularly wrong, keeping your own notes may be entirely rational. If the written process is outdated, asking the experienced person how the work actually happens may be more sensible. If the leadership says you have authority to make this decision, but then reverses the decision every time someone complains, escalating everything to the owner becomes predictable self-protection. People will adapt to the evidence they receive. And this is the exact same mechanism we just discussed with customers. The internal employees learn what actually happens here, and when they cannot trust the official system, they build their personal systems around it. When people cannot trust the system, they build personal systems around it. And those personal systems create operational cost, duplicate entry, data entry, verification work, defensive documentation, extra communications, unnecessary checking, bypass, owner rescue. But notice something very important. These behaviors did not begin as incompetence. They begin as perfectly reasonable adaptations to an unreliable environment. Which leads to the key question. Can an employee exercise good judgment if they cannot trust the information that the system provides on which they are supposed to base that judgment? If you tell me, use your judgment, but the data that I'm supposed to use is unreliable, you have not given me a safe environment for exercising judgment. And the supporting question is, can someone safely accept responsibility if they cannot rely on the authority supposedly granted? Responsibility without dependable authority produces defensive behavior every time. People will check, they will escalate, they will delay, they will protect themselves. The system has taught them what to expect. Now let's take these individual workarounds and let them accumulate. Eventually, the organization effectively has two operating systems. On the left, the official system, designed, documented, the process people are supposed to rely on, the CRM, the SOP, the workflows, role assignments, responsibilities, job descriptions, the project board. And the intentions behind it are perfectly reasonable. One dependable source for the work. But what we see on the right is the actual survival system. Unofficial, fragmented, person and personality dependent, private worksheets, notebooks, personal reminders, direct conversations in Slack. Asking Sarah, asking the owner, that is the system people are actually relying on to get by. And no single one of these workarounds is particularly dangerous. Someone keeping a note will be harmless. Someone double checking with Sarah because Sarah knows sounds like wisdom. Someone sending a message to double check a handoff seems reasonable. And in isolation, each of these probably is. But collectively, these behaviors are telling us something. They're telling us that the organization has declared one system as authoritative, but its people have learned through their operating experience that they cannot rely safely on that authoritative system. That is a trust problem inside the operation. It's not a branding problem. It's not a morale slogan, an operating problem. The official system does exist. But existence of the official system is not the same thing as earned reliance. And that is why a system would the bottom line matters. If the official system were entirely trusted and easy enough to use, there would be no need for a survival system. The question we're trying to ask here is, what would have to become true before the people in the organization could safely stop maintaining their private backup systems? That's the issue here. Notice the word safely, not how do we force everyone to stop using their own notes and use the official system. That could technically be easy. Ban spreadsheets, ban access to Google Drive. Congratulations, we solved absolutely nothing. The question is, what would have had to become true for the workarounds to become unnecessary? The information would need to stay current enough to rely upon. The handoffs would need to mean something. Operational roles would need to be clear. Authority should match responsibility. When the processes change, the official system should change too to keep up with it. Exceptions would need a usable path, and people would need enough evidence over time to conclude, yes, I can actually use this system without keeping my own shadow copy just in case. And that's where next week's conversation is going to become very useful. Because we're going to talk about how you build those systems. But I do not want to solve that today. Today, I want us to just simply see what the workarounds are telling us. The workarounds are evidence. In the same way that the customer's repeated experience is evidence. In the same way that a business partner's experience is evidence. In the same way that our automated behavior is evidence, internal operations teach staff what deserves to be relied upon. And some of you will recognize this relationship funnel from earlier. Recognition, conversion, trust, opportunity, business. We've used this before to describe how a relationship can move toward a business opportunity. And we use it in comparison to the traditional marketing AIDA kinds of models. People become aware of us, a conversation begins, trust begins to develop, the opportunity then becomes visible, which leads to business. The relationship funnel says it's not about what we are broadcasting, it's about the relationships that we're building. But today I want to mature one part of that model. There's a return path from business to trust. It is operating evidence. Because the sale does not freeze trust permanently. The customer saying yes once does not mean trust is complete. We may now stop producing evidence. The customer has simply decided that the evidence available so far is sufficient to enter the business relationship. And then the business begins operating. And that produces new evidence. The sales promise, the onboarding, the handoffs, the delivery, the support, the billing, the automations, the recoveries, every one of these can confirm the customer's earlier judgment, or they can challenge it. Trust may help create the business relationship. Operations determine whether the relationship deserves to continue receiving trust. And that applies beyond the customer too. Think about that referral partner. They're not simply deciding whether they like you. When they make an introduction, they attach some of their own reputation to the relationship. So they are actually deciding, can I reasonably rely on this business to handle the person I'm introducing in a way that I'm willing to be associated with? Again, operating evidence. The business can behave in increasingly trustworthy ways. It can produce stronger evidence, but the decision to rely still belongs with the other stakeholder. So another useful way to say this is the evidence belongs to the operation. The decision to rely belongs to the stakeholder. That concept preserves agency on both sides of the equation. The operator has agency over how the business is governed, which produces evidence. The customer, the referral partner, the associate has agency over whether to continue the relationship. The employee has agency over what they're willing to accept and rely on internal to the system. A trustworthy system does not have to remove those choices in order to become more predictable. In fact, meaningful trust assumes that those choices exist. Which takes us back to where we started. What are you teaching people to expect from your operation, from your business, from your nonprofit? Not what do I want them to think about me? Not my favorite networking question. What question do I wish people would ask so that they would be a more informed consumer? Not what does my about page say? Not even, or maybe especially not, what values did we put on the wall in our lobby? The real question, what is the business repeatedly demonstrating? Look again at this operational sequence. We made a decision which we automated, or we SOP'd, but effectively the same thing. We created a system which produces repeated behavior. That repeated behavior is the evidence that fuels people's expectations. And when that expectation becomes consistent, people decide whether they can rely on that evidence with trust. Somebody has made a decision, and that decision becomes a behavior. The behavior repeats. Other people perceive the evidence shapes their expectations, and they decide whether they're willing to rely upon that evidence. They don't care about your decision. They don't care about your process. They don't care about your system. They don't care about your SOP. But they see the evidence. So I would leave you with several questions about your actual operations. Fundamentally, what is my business currently teaching people to expect? And be very careful with that one. Now, what do you intend to teach them? What has the evidence actually taught them? Second, which expectations did we create intentionally, and which ones have emerged accidentally? Maybe you intentionally taught customers that appointments begin on time. Good. But maybe you accidentally taught employees do not make a decision until the owner confirms it. That's useful evidence. Third, can customers, employees, and partners rely on the information and commitments that we give them? Fourth, what happens when the normal processes stop fitting the reality? Does anyone in the organization notice? Who owns the change? Where does the authority shift? Does the affected person know what is happening? Does communication start reflecting the new reality? Or do we continue repeating yesterday's rule because that is what the system is configured to do without response to the reality? Fifth, where are people maintaining workarounds because they do not trust the official process or their official procedure? Do not begin by blaming the workaround. Ask what evidence made the workaround rational. Because most people didn't make something up, or make up their own way to do things because they wanted to circumvent the system. And one more question, because agency has been part of this entire sequence that we've been teaching in August. Whose agency are we making smaller because it makes some other part of our system easier to operate? Are we constraining the customer? Are we constraining the employee? Are we constraining our partners? Are we constraining ourselves as the operator? Yes, predictability is useful. But a system should not achieve predictability by removing meaningful choice from everyone who has to live inside that system. So let's bring this whole month of August together into a theme. On August 3rd, we said judgment determines what belongs inside our system. On August 10th, we said that judgment determines whether an outside answer that has been suggested to us belongs in our context or whether it should be rejected. Last week, we said judgment determines what decisions we've made deserve to be repeated and where authority over those repeat decisions, repeat executions should exist. Today, we're saying that judgment is becoming observable to the outside entities through our repeated and dependable behavior. People are learning what to expect from what the business repeatedly does. When the normal path works, they receive evidence. The promise had meaning, the information carried forward, the handoff worked well, responsibility was visible. And when the normal path breaks, they are actually receiving stronger evidence. They are seeing, did somebody notice? Did somebody own the change? Did the change move to the right person of authority? Does the business respond to the new reality? Or does the business just blithely continue repeating yesterday's rule? This is why reliability does not mean nothing ever goes wrong. It means the system remains governable when something does. The business is producing the evidence, but the business does not get the final vote. The customer decides whether to rely on the evidence. The employee decides whether the official system is dependable enough to use on a consistent basis. The partner decides whether the relationship is safe enough to recommend. Thus, operations produce evidence of trustworthiness. People with agency decide whether that evidence is sufficient to be worthy of trust. Which leads us one last time to today's core question. What are you teaching people to expect? Because that is where your judgment is becoming visible. That is where your operations are becoming evidence. And that is where the other person decides whether your business deserves trust. Thank you. And before I sign off today, I want to tell you where we're going next. We've spent August examining judgment from several different directions, where judgment belongs, which outside answers fit inside our system, what inside our system should repeat, and today, what other people are learning to expect from that repetition. Next week, our friends Dave Robbs and David Robbs from Precision Consultants are coming back. And we're going to move from the conceptual level into organizational practice. Today, we looked at things like, can people rely on the official system? Does responsibility remain clear? Do internal handoffs work? Can authority move to the appropriate person? Does organizational behavior remain dependable when the work has to move between people? Next week, Dave and David are going to help us look at how things like SOPs, process ownership, role clarity, organizational memory, and management systems make those concepts practical. We're not trying to create an organization for you where nothing ever goes wrong, because something will go wrong. The more useful question is, how does each of us build an organization dependable enough that people do not need to reinvent or personally protect the system every time something changes? So please come back next week. Dave and David are very good people to help us make that practical. For today, this is enough. Operations produce evidence of trustworthiness. People decide whether the evidence is sufficient to trust. I'm Keith Bashirs. Thank you for thinking about this with me.